Well, hello friends, and welcome to another Ask Zach. I hope you're doing well today. Today we are going to talk about amp placement, and the reason is I've got emails about it, and I realize what a practical thing that is, and how everyone has to deal with that that's using an amp live, and I deal with that every time I go and play out. So today we're going to talk about putting on the ground, leaning it back, getting it on a chair, baffling it. We're going to talk about all those things. I'm not going to say one way is better than the other. These are just tools for you when you're out in the wild playing, for you to deal with the situations you're probably going to be affected by. So you're going to run into these things. All right. So before we get started, if you've been enjoying the show and or been watching the shows and you haven't subscribed yet, well, please go down in the corner and do so. Also, if you've already subscribed, then I really appreciate you supporting the channel, which is what keeps the content going. Now, there's good old tip jar information in the description, or you can go to askzach.com, and there you can find out about Friends of Ask Zach, which is a way to support the channel on a monthly basis. And doing so, you get to see the episodes early without commercials. And you also you get these Ask Zach D'Andrea celluloid guitar picks that are medium heavy, and a thank you note from me. And then there's also merch at askzach.com, another way. So this is the It's a Sickness shirt, which is a lot of times I talk about having multiples of certain things that I like, especially like when at one point I had 5 Mostortion pedals, and it's a sickness. So it's about that obsession level that we have with guitar. That's what this shirt's about. So let's just dive in. All right. So most of the time, of course, when I'm playing out, I'm going to be using this deluxe reverb, and usually I'll have a backup too. I'll use the Tone Master Deluxe, or sometimes I have a 64 Vox AC10 that's been rehoused, and it's a 112. And those are kind of the amps I play out the most with. I also have I have one of the Chris Stapleton Princetons, and I have a 59 Harvard, and I have a new Fender Vibrachamp reverb that I use for really small gigs, like duo kind of things and stuff like that. But those are kind of the amps that I use. But most of the time, I'm going to show up with the Deluxe or the Vox AC10. All right, and so as far as placement, my preference is to have the amp on the floor and about 5 to 8 feet behind me, okay? And with that, by having the amp on the floor, you get the maximum amount of, for lack of a better term, bigness. You get, it's coupled with the floor, and so it's going to resonate. And that way, your amp is going to sound as big and as beautiful as it's going to sound, okay? And that's a preference of a lot of players. A lot of players like to have their amp on the ground. And then by having it a couple feet back, you actually get to hear the full sound of the amp. Because if you have it on the ground and it's right behind you, just a foot or two, well, guess what? Most of the sounds and the volume is just going past you, and you're not even hearing what the amp, really sounds like. Okay? So that's my ideal situation. That, the stage has to be big enough, and, the engineer has to allow, that level of volume. But a lot of times I'm allowed to do that, and it's not a problem. Okay, so let's talk about the engineer says, you're too loud. Okay. Well, at that point, I'll think about, okay, can I turn down a little bit and still get the sound that I want? Or do I need to keep it at that volume level? If I can turn down, I will. If I can't, if I need to have it at that volume setting to get the sound that I want, then what I'll do is I will baffle the amp somehow. So that can be multiple different things. Sometimes, it can be as simple as this is the Tukey cover that I use for my amps. And these, I like them because they have this Velcro strap on the bottom that holds them in place, and these are padded. I really like these covers a lot. I don't have an endorsement or anything with them. I've been buying these for 20 plus years. So sometimes I'll just set this in front of the amp, and it will block a certain level of sound. Another thing I'll do is I'll bunch this up and put it in front and under the front end of the amp just to lean it back a little bit. And also this will absorb a little bit of sound also. So that's one level. The problem with putting the cover in front of the amp is it doesn't really look very good. So now most of the time I will take 2 amps, not because I'm going to use them, but I always carry a backup. So one really great thing to do as far as baffling, if you've got 2 amps and you're not going to use the other one, is you just put the other one in front of the other. And so that way, again, the sound is going to be diffused and blocked by this amp, okay, in front of the other one. So you've got the other one either mic'd up or maybe you're not mic'd up. But anyway, this is going to help out a ton, okay? So just by putting this in front of the other amp, it's going to block that beam that's coming off of a 12-inch speaker that's usually hitting either the audience or the the sound engineer, sometimes right in the face. So this is a great solution. And if you don't have another amp, many times it shows you can find something to baffle the amp. All right. So another situation that you run into is, let's say the stage isn't very big, okay? And that happens a lot. So you have a stage where you can't get the amp 5 to 8 feet behind you. Well, in those situations, I usually will not put the amp on the ground simply because so much of the sound is just going to be blowing past me. Now, if it's a really loud gig and nobody cares, I might do it. But most of the time, I want to be able to hear my amp. And the reason I want to hear my amp well is because, I play Telecaster, but I also do a lot of string bending. And I always want my bends to be in tune. And I find that for me to be in tune with my bends, I really need to be hearing, the high end, from the speaker, not bouncing off the walls and things like that. So in a situation where the stage is smaller and I can't have the amp further back, that's when I will either lean the amp back, if that works, to get me enough sound from, treble coming from the speaker, or I will go ahead and find a folding chair or a milk, crate or a beer crate or what have you, but something to get the amp, at least a couple feet off the ground. So, like on my shows, I always, have the amp up, high. And that just, and what that does is you're able to hear the amp and you're able to hear the highs, and I'm able to play more in tune, especially with my bending. Now, here's what you lose by getting your amp off the ground. You decouple it from the floor, which means you're going to lose bass, okay? So that's going to make, a lot of guys hate that, and there's a lot of guys that will not play without having their amp directly on the floor. They don't want to decouple it. They want that low end. And I don't blame them. So, but, sometimes it's just what you have to do. And in those cases, I might turn the bass up a little bit, on the amp if it has a bass control, or you just kind of get right with it, as it were. So, and you just kind of, move forward and you be easy to get along with guy. All right. So another situation you're going to run into is you're going to run into rooms that are overly bassy. Okay. And in those situations, you absolutely want to get your amp off the ground because you're just adding to the problem, okay? So, get your amp off the ground, try to turn the bass down and just kind of get over it. Try to get as much, direct sound going as possible and try not to have as much, reverberating around. And in that kind of situation, I might also use, my little amp cover. I might put it behind the amp to reduce the amount of sound that's coming out of the back of the amp. So that's another technique. Another situation you can come into is just a room that's just really bouncy and everything's reverberating around, and that's another situation where you want to get the amp up. You want to get it away from the floor. You want to get it to where you're hearing as much direct sound as possible. And, and you might want to baffle the back of the amp, or, who knows. Now, in these situations, you can also run into things where it's just like they're just telling you over and over you're too loud. And then you get the thing, well, turn the amp around. Well, okay. Well, then you have, you turn the amp around, and if they're still saying it's too loud, well, you can, of course, baffle the back. The amp's already turned, against the wall. Well, you can baffle the back. And then in those situations where they're still screaming that you're too loud, this is kind of the most extreme measure. And sometimes you just run into these things where you have to be really low volume. And in these situations, I will bring a stand. And this is not my favorite to use. And wow, I have got this all in my amp. Okay, here we go. All right, so this is a lean back amp stand. So this is welded. This was actually made by String Swing, the company that makes the guitar hanger thing, where you put into the wall, and they make a lot of display things for guitar shops. Well, for True Tone, they made a couple of these years ago. They just welded these together, and we used these at trade shows. Again, because it was trying to reduce volume so that we wouldn't get into as much trouble with the volume, the dB police at the NAMM show. And so this is what I call worst case scenario. So I bring this when you're really going to have a volume situation. And so one, you can put the amp behind you and leaning back into where it hits you right at the back of the head. And then if it's a situation where they're like, still, it's too much, well, then you get in the situation where you put it in front of you like a monitor. So basically you have your amp right in front of you, leaning back, hitting you in the face. And in that situation, I probably won't take a deluxe reverb or the Vox. I'll probably take a Princeton or the Harvard or the little Vibrachamp, because then you're talking about a really low volume situation. Again, you're getting paid to play. And so you're supposed to be, providing solutions. You're a problem solver. So if you're a problem, then you're less likely to get hired back. So this is worst case scenario. And sometimes, if you're playing, in an orchestra or for a show or at a church or something like that, this is what, sometimes you just end up having to do something like this. And you don't have to have this exactly. There's all sorts of ways you can lean your amp back. You can use a wedge, from to like hold a door open, or all sorts of things. But you definitely want to have a situation where the amp's not going to fall over during the show. So make sure it is secure. And of course, if it's a situation even worse than that, then you probably won't be able to use an amp at all. And you're going to be in a, going direct and using a Kemper, Iridium, et cetera, et cetera. So, but those are just, kind of my, my practical tips as far as amps. Again, if I have my druthers, I'm going to have the amp on the floor, and I'm going to have it, a couple feet back where I'm able to hear the full sound of the guitar. But then just depending on the room and the situation, you just have to kind of roll with the punches, depending on if there's too much bass or too much reflection. And also, if there's too much reflection, you turn the reverb down. You might use less delay and be more direct sounding so that things aren't just bouncing around everywhere. And everyone has to kind of be, cognizant of that so that you sound good. In the studio, you have some, usually a lot of engineers will want to have the amp off the floor because they don't want that extra low end at all. And now some engineers will be okay with you leaving the amp on the floor, but the majority of them are going to say, I want the amp off the floor, and so that I have control over that, and I don't have all this low end that's going to be fighting with the bass. And that's completely legitimate and understandably so. All right, guys. Well, I hope you've enjoyed today's episode and today's look at amp positioning. I hope this was good and practical, and be sure and put comments below and in any other techniques that you've come up with. I know guys will get plexiglass and stuff like that, but that's a little much for me. But yeah, just put your comments below, and you know what? I'll see you next time. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.